Breaking Up with Addiction is proudly sponsored by experts you can trust. Kindbridge Behavioral Health. Safe, non-judgmental counseling just a tap away. Welcome to Breaking Up with Addiction. I'm Corinne Wright, certified recovery and executive coach. Our co-host Gwen will be joining us a little bit later. In today's episode, we're diving into an essential topic of understanding gambling addiction, the different types of gamblers. From social gamblers to those struggling with pathological gambling, understanding where someone falls on the spectrum of gambling behaviors is crucial in recognizing the signs of addiction and taking the first steps towards recovery. We'll break down the official classifications of gamblers and explore the unique characteristics of each type. Whether you're personally affected or supporting someone who is, this episode will give you valuable insights into how gambling habits develop and how to address them effectively. Stay tuned as we navigate through the various stages of gambling behavior and what it means for lasting recovery. Before we dive into today's episode, let's do a quick homework recap. Were you able to identify 3 things that you can do to break the cycle of gambling addiction in your family? Now, if you're stuck there, please go back to episode 1, How Did We Get Here? And listen to each episode after for more than enough ideas on how you can break the cycle. Breaking the cycle of addiction requires a multifaceted approach that involves recognizing patterns, understanding the underlying causes, and taking proactive steps towards change. This includes recognizing the triggers. To do that, you must identify the emotional, environmental, and physical factors that prompt the addictive behavior. Recognizing the patterns of cravings, behavior, temporary relief, guilt, and relapse, these are all important parts of being able to fight the addiction and break the cycle. Identifying emotional and psychological drivers, understanding the emotional needs driving addiction, such as stress, trauma, or validation. Developing healthy coping mechanisms, replacing addictive behaviors with healthier alternatives like exercise, meditation, or hobbies. These are all things that you can do to attempt to break that cycle. Build a support network, engage with loved ones, support groups, or professionals, get help. Seek accountability. Establishing boundaries and new routines. Avoid the trigger environments or the people or the things that draw you into those habits. Practicing self-compassion is another thing you must do because you're already dealing with a lot of negative self-talk in your head. So you would have to start by speaking to yourself kindly to change and quiet that voice. Setting realistic goals for yourself might also be something to consider. Some people have a hard time ripping off the Band-Aid, but there is a thing called harm reduction where you set healthy boundaries and reduce the amount of gambling, reduce the amount of spending, reduce everything, making your way to complete abstinence, and creating a long-term plan. Whether or not you go back and listen to those episodes, I've just given you a snapshot of several things that you can do to break that cycle if you haven't already began last week's homework. Now today, our focus is on the different types of gamblers. As you listen to today's episode, we would like you to try to identify where your behaviors fall in the spectrum to determine what type of gambler you or someone close to you might be. One important thing to know about the different types of gamblers is that gambling behavior exists on a spectrum, and individuals can move between categories at any given time. Social gambling to problem gambling. From social gambling to pathological gambling. There is no step ladder order of they must go through this phase and then this phase. Anyone who gambles a first time or a 30th time is vulnerable to gambling addiction. Understanding the spectrum helps in identifying the early signs of a developing problem and emphasizes the importance of early intervention and support. You can find the information that we're going to share with you today in the 5th edition of the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual on Mental Health, the 11th edition of the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, and in the NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So let's get started. Social gamblers. We all know social gamblers. In fact, most people probably assume that they are social gamblers because it is known as a social activity. It has been normalized as a social activity. They typically gamble occasionally, such as during a night out with friends or a family event, or at a casino for fun. Their gambling behavior is usually non-problematic, and they are able to stop gambling without it affecting their daily lives or causing negative consequences. This is the definition of a social gambler. Now, an example of a social gambler would be Sarah. She enjoys going to the casino with friends once or twice a month. She sets a budget for how much she'll be willing to spend and views it as fun rather than an opportunity to win money. If she wins, it's a bonus. But if she loses, it's not going to impact her financially or emotionally. She's able to walk away from the game when the night is over and doesn't feel compelled to gamble outside of these social events. Can any of you relate to Sarah? Now let's talk about a problem gambler. Hence the word problem. If you really wanted to know the definition of a problem gambler, that's the definition. When gambling causes a problem, you are a problem gambler. Problem gambling is categorized by an increasing preoccupation with gambling, but without full-blown addiction. The gambler may experience negative consequences but hasn't yet fully lost control over their behavior. A problem gambler is someone whose gambling behavior starts to interfere with their daily life, relationships, or finances. While they may not be addicted yet, their gambling has begun to cause negative consequences, such as financial difficulties, relationship strains, or emotional distress. They may attempt to stop gambling but find it difficult to control their urges. An example of a problem gambler would be John. John started gambling as a way to relax after work. At first, it was just small bets with friends or occasional trips to the casino. However, over time, he found himself gambling more frequently, often using money meant for bills or essentials. He tells himself he'll stop after one more bet. But the urge is overwhelming. He becomes secretive about his gambling behavior, and his family starts to notice he's withdrawing from them and missing important events. John is becoming stressed about his finances and feeling guilty, but still struggling to cut back or stop completely. Problem gamblers may experience stress and conflicts related to their gambling, but they still retain some control. Their behavior can cause harm in their relationships, finances, or job, but it is not yet debilitating. Can you relate to John? Are you someone right now who is gambling, but you're negotiating with yourself on whether or not you can tap into your bill and essential money? And then you do it with the hopes of, I'll just make it back, I'll make more, I'll double it. And then you lose it. And then you're borrowing money from family members, and they're not really sure why when you have a good job. Where's your money going? Well, let's take a look at the pathological gamblers. This is the most severe form of gambling disorder. Pathological gambling, also known as gambling addiction, is a compulsive and uncontrollable urge to gamble despite negative consequences, such as severe financial personal loss. Either of those, severe is the key word here, severe financial or personal loss. Now, this is going beyond just tapping into your bill money. Maybe you are a problem gambler and you tap into your bill money here and there, but you're still able to maintain your lifestyle. The pathological gambler is tap, 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 tap. The taps do not stop. And there is spiraling, because now imagine if you were a problem gambler and every 3 or 4 months you're borrowing money from a certain family member. And maybe in between that, you'd borrow a couple of bucks from friends to not, leave suspicion of you needing help, but to kind of fill in the gaps for you. But now you've created a circle of people that you've been leaning on, or maybe there's just one person that continues to consistently bail you out. And you're telling yourself that you don't have a problem, but you're behind on your bills. You've slipped into debt. Your emotions are out of control. You feel like you can't escape how it feels to be in the situation gambling has got you in. And now you just need a way out. So you got to make one more bet to try to win that money back. You're chasing your losses. You're going through all the extremes. But let's take a look at an example of what that can look like for someone. Now, we know the pathological gambler is someone who has developed a gambling addiction, where gambling becomes a compulsion that dominates their life, as I just kind of described how it increases from problem to pathological. Their behaviors often lead to severe consequences, including significant financial loss, significant being the key word, damaged relationships, because again, if you're borrowing money consistently, more than likely you're not being honest about what you're borrowing that money for. And if you get caught in a lie, or if you continue to borrow and not pay back, or whatever the case may be, it's the non-truths, it's the dishonesty, it's this new persona that you're having to put on as a mask to hide what's going on. But this gambler continues to gamble despite the negative impact it has on their life, their personal life, their professional life, their financial well-being. They cannot stop. An example would be Emily. Emily has been gambling for years, but over the past several months, her gambling has spiraled out of control. She spends most of her paycheck at the casino, often using credit cards or taking out loans to fund her habit. Despite repeated efforts to quit, she finds herself gambling more and more, unable to resist the urge. Emily lies to her family about where she's going and the money she's spending, and she's starting to borrow money from family members and friends to cover her debts. Her relationship with her spouse is falling apart, and she's even started missing work. She knows her behavior is destructive, but she can't seem to stop, even though it's impacting every aspect of her life. Can you relate to Emily? Emily is someone right now, today, struggling with this addiction and dealing with the roller coaster of the waves of emotions that come over her. Emily is probably someone that's anticipating her next paycheck to get caught up with the bills that gambling has put her in the hole for. But paychecks can be a trigger for gambling. When you see that paycheck hit, if it's not in the negative, then there's probably somewhere in your mind that's telling you, take a portion of that and win that money back, instead of paying the bills and getting caught up and creating a plan. And so what happens is Emily ends back up in that same spiral because she's negotiating with herself, telling herself, well, I can do this. And that's the disordered thinking that comes with pathological gambling, is that one more bet, I'll win. Next time, we can recover. All of the thoughts that this game of chance has no promise to deliver. Let's do a trivia question and answer. Which U.S. state has the highest percentage of adults who report gambling at least once a month? Nevada, home of Las Vegas, where gambling is a major part of the state's economy and culture, and has the highest percentage of adults who report gambling at least once a month. Now, there's a detail here that makes the difference between the social and the pathological gambler. You can gamble at least once a month and be a social gambler. you can gamble at least once a month and be a pathological gambler. How? It weighs in your ability to stop. If I go to the casino once a month and I have a budget of $25, that's my budget. I know people really do take a few $100s out to gamble because that's just how you budget for it. But for me, once I lose more than $20, I'm done. And so let's say I go in once a month, I spend my little $20 however I want, whether it's on the coin machines or this or that. And I'm there for the fun of it. And I'm done when I'm done. 20's gone, we're done. Once a month, I can do that socially. The pathological gambler cannot do that. Yes, they can go once a month, sure. But while they're there, what's happening is there's no boundary. There's no boundary of time. The amount of time they'll spend in that casino could be days. There's no boundary on amount of money. Once the money runs out, where's the ATM? Once that's over, where's the credit card? Once that's over, who can I call to borrow money from? And so these are the differences between social and pathological. But there is much more to come. The prevalence of pathological gambling is influenced by various factors, including the ability of gambling venues, culture, attitudes towards gambling, and the effectiveness of regulatory measures. Countries with widespread access to gambling and limited support systems tend to report higher rates of gambling addiction. Pause. Efforts to address this issue include implementing stricter regulations, promoting responsible gambling practices, and providing accessible treatment options for those affected. However, the effectiveness of these measures varies, and ongoing research and policy development are crucial in combating gambling addiction globally. Hence, why we developed this podcast. We want to be another resource for all individuals out there struggling with gambling addiction on any level. Research has highlighted that pathological gambling is a significant concern in several countries around the world. In Australia, around 0.5 to 1% of adults experiencing serious gambling issues, with additional 1.4 to 2.1 at moderate risk, driven in part by the country's high per capita gambling losses. Similarly, in the United Kingdom, a recent survey shows that 2.5% of British adults are affected by problem gambling, with online gambling rising amongst young men contributing to the increase. This is an article in The Guardian. In Hong Kong, approximately 5.8% of the population struggles with gambling addiction, largely influenced by the normalization of gambling activities like horse racing and lotteries. And finally, Southeast Asia, particularly in areas like Singapore and Malaysia, also show high levels of problem gambling, with some refugee populations reporting lifetime prevalence rates as high as 59%. This is from a 2016 Gateway Foundation article. The prevalence of gambling addiction in these regions is influenced by cultural factors, the availability of gambling venues, and limited access to treatment options. Those three things we can repeat 1,000 times. There are always going to be problems if you don't have enough resources in areas where the addiction is high. That number 59% is pretty high. As a result, global efforts are focusing on regulation, responsible gambling practices, and accessible treatment to address the widespread issue. Now I'm going to pass it to Gwen as she continues to unpack the different types of gamblers.
Thanks, Corinne. Let's take a look at the compulsive gambler. Compulsive gambling, also known as pathological gambling, I believe it was referred, the actual gambling disorder was referred to pathological gambling in an earlier version of the DSM. I believe it was the DSM-4. We're currently utilizing the DSM-5. So anyway, it's known as a pathological gambler or a gambling addiction. And it involves a strong, uncontrollable urge to gamble despite the negative consequences that may occur. The compulsive gambler may feel that they cannot stop gambling and may even continue gambling as a way to escape their problems, deal with their emotions, or even as an unhealthy coping skill to deal with stress. So, in order to get a better idea of what this compulsion looks like, let's look at some compulsive behaviors. Many of you have probably heard people say something like, she or he is very OCD. They like to clean up all the time. They're referring to obsessive compulsive disorder. And what this involves is compulsive behaviors that are like repetitive actions or thoughts driven by like a strong urge, like you got to get it out there. And it's often used to actually deal with things like anxiety, fear. Let's look at some examples. Cleaning and washing, as I previously referred to, excessive hand washing, cleaning surfaces repeatedly. Just imagine you've already maybe cleaned your kitchen counter 10 times, but then you continue to feel an urge, a need to go back and clean it again and again and again. I mean, are you getting a picture here of what that would look like for a compulsive gambler? So, this may not be something that this person is dealing with in reference to the person who's struggling with continuously cleaning the counter. So maybe this could be something that happened just occasionally. But imagine if this was a severe case and this was going on like on a daily basis. Just imagine the chaos. I mean, the stress that this person is experiencing over and over again. That would have to be a huge challenge for someone in their life. Another example is repeatedly checking doors, locks, appliances, or even the stove to ensure that it's turned off. Now, that sounds kind of scary to have a fear or an obsession that your stove is not turned off and going back and forth. That could be extremely stressful. Ordering and arranging items in a specific way. So let's examine chronic gamblers. These are individuals who have been gambling for a prolonged period of time, and it has become a persistent and destructive habit. They experience long-term negative effects that often show up in their lives as financial instability, damage to relationships, and poor mental health. And just like the other gamblers that we have talked about today, they continue to gamble despite these consequences. Chronic conditions, that's what I think of when I think of chronic. That's something that doesn't seem like it's prolonging. It's going on for some time. People who have maybe chronic medical conditions, just kind of to give you an idea that these behaviors are actually associated with conditions like anxiety disorder, depression, personality disorders, and even substance use disorders. Chronic behaviors, they can also be a result of learned patterns or environmental factors. And people exhibit these chronic behaviors in different ways. Let's look at some examples of those. One of these challenging behaviors could be aggression. Aggression is something that people deal with over extended periods of time. It can become chronic, and many people end up being treated for it through anger management and other treatment opportunities that are similar. This aggression could be physical, could be verbal aggression, or even emotional aggression. This is another example of something that could be really plaguing you over an extended amount of time, and you could have extreme difficulty trying to change it. So what about non-compliance? Some people are just known as notorious rule breakers. Refusal to follow rules, instructions, or requests. Everybody knows that about this person, and it definitely causes issues in their life. Substance abuse, we've talked about that a lot since we've started educating our listeners about gambling addiction. Substance abuse is something that co-occurs with it at a very high rate. So we already know. I'm sure that many of you have family members or friends who have dealt with some kind of either a drug or an alcohol addiction. And it could wreak havoc on your life. And it can be very difficult to change that behavior. Of course, just like gambling addiction, the person would need to seek some type of treatment. So withdrawal, isolation, maybe some people call them introverts, okay? But they like to isolate. They like to be alone a lot. If this is just who this person is and they're getting some healthy level of socialization, I see nothing wrong with that. But if this person, when I see a person chronically isolating, what comes to mind for me as a clinician is, let's look further. Is there some depression there? Are you experiencing depressive symptoms? Because isolation is a huge indicator of depression. So let's look at one more: maladaptive coping mechanisms. Using unhealthy or harmful behaviors to cope with stress. I know I just talked about substance abuse, but a lot of times that's how it starts. It's just that, wow, I had a really, really hard day. I had a stressful day. I think I'm going to have a glass of wine. And then maybe the next day, oh, I thought things would get better. It's still stressful. I think I'll have 2 glasses. And then you keep that behavior up. And over time, of course, we've talked to y'all about tolerance. So you're going to need more of this wine. And this is going to become chronic and then potentially lead to an addiction. Yeah. Also avoidance, daydreaming about your situation and avoiding the problems and the challenges that you have in life are not going to help them to get better. This would be considered a maladaptive coping technique or strategy. We've reviewed all of these chronic behaviors that can also be problematic. Let's get back to the chronic gambler. They have experienced long-term negative effects, often including, but not limited to, financial instability, damage to relationships, and poor mental health. But despite all of these negative consequences, they continue to gamble. This next type of gambler is characteristic of individuals who engage in gambling behavior that increases the likelihood of them developing gambling problems. They may not be addicted yet, but they are definitely showing signs of potential problems. And I know that you listeners have learned a lot from the information that Corinne and I provide. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the high-risk gambler. They may engage in gambling for longer periods or with larger stakes or more money than social gamblers do. This action actually increases the likelihood of them developing addiction. Let's break down some of the high-risk gambling behavior and a few of the consequences that go with this. I'm sure you could guess the first thing is financial problems. They find themselves spending more money on gambling than intended, leading to a lot of debt and relying on others to cover their gambling losses. Listeners, do you know anybody like this? And their time commitments? Sorry, this is probably not the gambler that you want to ask to do a favor like pick up your cake for the birthday party, because they spend an excessive amount of time gambling, neglecting other responsibilities like work, school, or family obligations, or just forgetting about favors that friends have asked them to do, which can not only affect relationships with their family, but with their friends as well. If all of this is going on, you can just imagine the emotional and psychological distress that they experience. Since they have this emotional distress, what do they turn to? They start gambling to escape problems or use it as an excuse. And they feel like they're relieving feelings of helplessness, guilt, anxiety, or depression. And like I mentioned earlier, there are relationship issues. Risky gambling behavior can strain or even break down important relationships, affecting family, friends, and partners. You have this partner that you have built a trusting relationship with, and you're starting to exhibit very risky gambling behavior. This is going to affect your partner. Your partner is going to be wondering, hey, are we going to have money for the mortgage? Are we going to be able to pay our bills? Yes, this definitely can cause some relation issues. And let's not even get to the lying and the concealment. So lying to family members or others about the extent of the gambling, or hiding the frequency, like how much they do it and the amount of it. And of course, it's going to lead to unsuccessful efforts to control gambling. So despite their efforts to repeatedly cut back or stop gambling, they struggle here. And when they do stop, they may experience symptoms like feeling restless or irritable, which is also going to affect their relationships. And there are definitely going to be some chasing losses. This high-risk gambler prioritizes gambling over other life goals. So this may lead to them neglecting responsibilities, sacrificing personal and professional goals, and experiencing negative consequences in various areas of their lives. And last, but certainly not least, what about the slot machine addicts? Imagine yourself. You enter into a casino. You're overwhelmed with all these bright lights, this excitement, loud sounds of people winning money, and you're like, yay, I want to be a part of that. This highly stimulating environment can completely draw a person in, right? And it could put them in almost like a trance where they totally ignore the outside world and they act before thinking about their losses. So there's a study that was published in the journal Neuroscience. And according to the results of this study, reward-linked stimuli, such as like slot machine, light, sound, and all the other stuff that they do, it can promote risky decision-making, particularly when audio and visual elements are used together. That's like the double effect, right? The researchers concluded that all of this stuff combined together can actually promote problem gambling. And I don't know if you've ever noticed, but casinos also play like background music to affect how people behave. They're putting on a certain type of music to kind of get you in a certain mood. And the mood that they want to get you in is the one that is most conducive to you spending your money and staying at that slot machine as long as possible. Slot machine addicts may be particularly vulnerable to becoming addicted to this fast-paced nature and the excitement of the slot machines. And we do know that most casinos put in a lot of effort to pull people into the slot machines. The slot machines are their bread and butter. That is where most of their income comes from. It's time for homework. For this week's assignment, we would like you to do some meditation and some self-reflection and utilize all of the information that Corinne and I have provided here today to determine what kind or what type of gambler you are. So knowledge is everything, because once you learn what the problem is, it's much easier to find a solution. Please join us next week. This is an episode you don't want to miss. we will be telling you everything about relapse prevention. Maybe I exaggerated, not everything, but quite a bit of information that can be extremely helpful in avoiding a relapse. Addiction doesn't define you, and breaking up with it doesn't have to be a solo mission. Kindbridge Behavioral Health offers safe, non-judgmental support anytime from anywhere. Visit kindbridge.com/appointments and start getting the help you deserve today.